Welcome, everyone. If you're just joining, we will start in just a few more seconds here. We're waiting for a few more folks to join. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Mark de la Iglesia, and I'm the Director for U.S. Democracy here at Freedom House. I am delighted to welcome you all to this conversation about strategies for addressing rising political violence in the United States. It's hard to think of a more timely and important topic with just 1 week to go before the elections here in the US. As many of you know, Freedom House was founded in 1941 to mobilize the American public to engage in the fight against Nazi Germany and the fascist threat to American security and values. For more than 80 years, this organization has sounded the alarm on threats to freedom and worked with policymakers to tackle those threats and offered direct support to human rights defenders and protectors of democracy around the world. We have also importantly spoken up about threats to freedom and democracy here in the US. This goes as far back as denouncing McCarthyism and Jim Crow racial segregation in the 1950s and 60s. And along the way, we have always been deeply, deeply committed to a nonpartisan approach, and that remains the case today. So particularly with the election coming up next week, I want to make very clear we do not endorse or oppose political candidates or parties. And we are fortunate today to have with us two leaders that exemplify that kind of nonpartisan commitment to defending democracy. Let me introduce them. Nicole Bibbins Sedaca is our interim president here at Freedom House. She leads over 300 of us working to expand and defend freedom around the world every day. And it's quite a role at this moment in history, and we're lucky to have her leading us. And Rachel Kleinfeld, who many of you know, is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But she really defies easy description. She's an academic expert in political violence for purposes of today's conversation, but she's also a thought leader, a strategist, and a catalyst for action on a range of issues related to democracy in the US and abroad. And we're very lucky to have her as a trustee of ours here at Freedom House. So Rachel and Nicole recently wrote in the Journal of Democracy about the growing political violence problem here in the US. And they highlighted 5 proven strategies that could help. So we're here to unpack those strategies and discuss how they can be advanced in both the short and the long term here in the US, as well as to field your questions. Before I turn to them, let me give a quick word on the format today. We're going to start with a few questions from me to outline and discuss those 5 strategies, and a couple of follow-ups, and then we'll save time for your questions in the second half of the conversation. So we encourage you to submit questions all along the way via the Q&A function, so that we have some to start with when we turn to that point. Now let's get started. I see we have almost 100 folks on the call now. That's great. Rachel, I'm hoping you can ground us here in the data about political violence in the US. So what are the key trends that we should be aware of, and how would you characterize the nature of America's political violence problem compared to what we see in other countries?
Sure. Thanks so much, Mark. It's such a huge pleasure to be here with you and Nicole, and Freedom House in general is obviously very close to my heart for the work you guys are doing all over the world. We in America have had outsized political violence for the kind of wealthy, consolidated democracy that we are. And we've had that for a long time. This is not our first rodeo with political violence. We had, the Know Nothing Party in the 1830s. We had violence in our Civil War. We had violence around the 1876 election that helped turn that election. What happens in America is kind of a rise and a fall. Our last rise and fall was in the 60s and 70s, and really started before that with the fight against the civil rights era, back to Brown v. Board in the 50s, and the repercussions of that and the backlash. That was the last time political violence started on the right, moved to the left, and as it moved to the left and grew, it was mostly property crime. This latest growth, and then it went down, 70s to recent years. It came up again in 2016, and it's a very stark year where you see 2015, end of 2015, beginning of 2016, just all the numbers start going up. So you see threats to members of Congress going up, threats to local officials going up, threats to election officials, which had been non-existent, going up, public health officials during COVID, you start seeing those rise, serious threats to federal judges going up, hate crimes, which had been going down, down, down after 9/11, all start going up. They're way above the 9/11 spike now, and they just won't stop. So that's been the general trend. Now that trend has changed over the last 2 years a little bit, and this is one of the success stories. First, we've seen organized groups go way down. The Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the kinds of things we were talking about a lot in 2020. Their organizing capacity, events that they've been engaged in, just plummeting. And that has to do with one of our strategies, fair law enforcement that holds people accountable, really important. Threats are still vastly too high, vastly higher than they were before 2016, but they've also been on a decline, which has to do, I think, with civility among public leaders who actually control the reins of power. And so we can talk about that later. And finally, I would just end with saying that people are really scared, and we can talk about that fear and that anxiety, but they're also often misperceiving the other side. So everyone's scared of everyone else without actually a very accurate perception of the other side. And this has to do with really bad polling that keeps coming up with people saying, you know, this percentage of Republicans justify political violence, or this percentage of Democrats justify political violence. And those numbers are really overblown. They're not good statistical studies. When we look seriously, it's about 3 or 4% of either side, pretty equal on both sides of the aisle, who justify political violence, probably lesser numbers that would actually commit it. And those are still too high. Every 1% in America is 2.5 million people. But it's way different than the numbers that people are throwing around and that are getting people so scared. So I think these trends are important to be aware of. It's worth realizing that we are in a very strong upward tick, and that other countries are too, which is what we wrote the article about, was to see what we could learn from some other countries.
Thank you. And just to follow up, how would you characterize what makes the type of political violence problem here and in the other countries you identify in the piece? You talk about European countries particular as distinctive. I think you say in the piece, in America, it's a political problem first, a violence problem second. Could you say more about that? And how
Sure.
it differentiates from like what we see in Latin America or in, you know, Mexico and Central America, for example, in terms of the nature of the political violence problem?
Sure, and I'm sure Nicole can add quite a bit to this, but basically, we see extremely high levels of political violence, violence against candidates and so on in Mexico, in Colombia, in South Africa. And often in these countries, what you have is actual criminality getting into politics. So basically, drug cartels who say, you know, either you bend to my will or I will kill you, to a mayor or a mayoral candidate. Organized criminal rings that have infiltrated politics, that are using their guns to affect policy decisions about who gets kickbacks for some government procurement in South Africa. That's a very different situation than what we're dealing with here in America, where it's primarily people who are impulsive, aggressive people who, instead of turning that impulsiveness and aggressiveness toward people in their near, vicinity, domestic violence or harm to their neighbors, they're turning it toward political targets because of the political rhetoric that's amped up anger and anxiety and agitation among Americans. So it's not that, some drug cartels going around acting in America, just a very different kind of problem.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Nicole, just to set the table further. So Freedom House, as I noted, works to advance freedom and democracy around the world. So why do you think this issue of political violence matters in that effort? And why does the state of political violence in the US in particular matter?
Excellent. Thank you for the question. Mark, thank you for your work. And Rachel, really delighted to have you both on our board, but also in this conversation today. Political violence is really a threat to the very foundation of what democracy is and the rights that we enjoy and are protected under a democracy. When I step back and I think about this moment in the United States, and I think about it in many other democracies around the world, you have to think the United States has 340 million people, approximately. We will always have diversity of views, diversity of ideologies, political views, and any number of other differences that come into a society that's that large. So the question is not whether we will have difference. The question is, how will we deal with those differences when they emerge? There is one direction, which is to deal with those through democratic institutions, through democratic norms and processes that we have that allow us to peaceably and civilly deal with those differences. We can go to the ballot box, we can peacefully protest, we can write to our congressperson, we can organize through different civil society groups. The alternative is to also say, I'm going to resolve my differences through political violence. It's the actual opposite of what democracy gives us the opportunity to do. So when we think about it, political violence is undermining democracy at its very foundational core. It threatens the rights of the victims of violence themselves, as well as that of the broader groups that violence is, because the violence is really designed to intimidate the broader community as well. And when political violence reaches dangerous levels, it can impede just the functioning of the democracy in general. And it can reinforce one of the trends that we're most concerned about, which is polarization and eroding social trust. We have seen that people's rights are threatened directly. I'm thinking about what we have seen. We've seen 2 assassination attempts on former President Trump, and I'm thinking about all of the shooting victims and the participants in Trump's rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, and their right to assemble and their right to express themselves were deeply, deeply violated on that day. Rachel talked about it, and it was in the piece. There are election officials around the country who are facing violent threats and harassment just for doing their jobs. These are the types of direct threats to people's rights that are part of the broader chilling effect that happens with political violence. But we know that this rising political violence is also adding to Americans' sense of mutual distrust and dislike of those that are different or from another party. And so it's also really a cycle and a deepening of our already concerning levels of polarization. We know that some surveys have shown that Americans across the political spectrum are increasingly wavering in their commitment to democratic values because they would like to ensure that their side wins. And that is really a concern for us as we're looking at the health of American democracy, which we know is so important both for Americans, but also for how the entire world is looking at the United States and looking at democracy.
Thank you. Well, let's get into these 5 specific strategies or proven pillars that you highlight. Rachel, the first strategy you outline is that political leaders must insist on nonviolence. Why is that so critical, and what have we seen in the US on that front?
So as human beings emotionally, we never really get past high school. We are very, very wired to belong, to be part of a group. We get scared when we're not part of a group. People sleep less well when they feel lonely. You can imagine our ancient reptilian brain saying, oh, I'm not part of a pack, I'd better wake myself up all the time. We're just meant to be social beings. And so we follow leaders. We're pack animals who follow leaders. And what leaders set as the norms of our group really matter for what it means to belong in that group, what you think you have to do to belong. And so there's tons of research, lab research, real life research, all sorts of research that shows that when political leaders say that violence is acceptable, it becomes more acceptable. And when they say no to political violence, their followers reduce their interest in using that as a political tool. It's not that people care about the leaders of the other side. So particularly in a binary system like ours, where you have just 2 sides to a coin without a real third or fourth or fifth party, it doesn't really matter what Democrats say about Republicans or Republicans say about Democrats, because it's your group that you're belonging to, and you need your group norms to be set by your leaders. So we need Democrats to enforce nonviolence within the Democratic Party, including against things like property violence and so on. And we need Republicans to enforce nonviolence within their party and to set those norms. And if leaders do that, it actually plays a huge role in getting their followers to say, okay, this isn't part of the group, I'll get kicked out of the group if I do this. And you can see this politically in past history, when US political parties have kept out more incendiary leaders, or also in the UK, in the 30s, quite famously, as fascism was rising in lots of different countries, Britain kept out its fascist leader from its sort of political system. There's a kind of cordon sanitaire right now in Germany against the most incendiary party. And you see that really having a strong effect on the norms of political violence within the major parties. In a two-party system, when we've managed to keep out that kind of rhetoric, it's played a calming role. When we don't do that, it's inflaming to people.
And what are you seeing specifically in the US?
So in the US, unfortunately, since 2015, we've seen a lot of rhetoric that's normalized violence. It is quite lopsided. So what you see is that that willingness to support political violence almost equal among Republicans and Democrats, 3 or 4% on both sides. But when you look at incidents of political violence, they're vastly higher on the right, according to every single study we have, looking at homicide or looking at other kinds of violent harms and so on. That doesn't mean they don't happen on the left. We saw Steve Scalise getting shot. We've seen these two attempts on Trump's life, although one of them clearly is not from the left, but is just a disturbed individual, which is frequently the case, honestly, in political violence, that the valence of the attacker is a little hard to pin down. But when you see that kind of both sides willing, but one side much more, you start looking at why, the accountability factors and also the group norms. And what we've seen is that the group norms, not only from the top, but also from lesser leaders, have been more accepting of violence on the right. On the left, you've had a lot of leaders, political leaders, saying no, but you are seeing fringes outside of the Democratic Party, but within the kind of left-wing community saying, well, this kind of violence is okay, or property violence is okay, and that's dangerous too. So you really need to just draw a line. We can't be burning ballots just because they're property rather than people, right? That there has to just be a line against all kinds of violence.
Thank you. So much more we could discuss there, but let me turn to the next strategy you highlight. Nicole, you talk about that governments and leaders must support the rule of law. That can mean a lot of things. So what does that look like in practice?
Right. The United States is a strong democracy that has both the written law as well as the institutions to enforce the law. We're not like many countries that are just beginning on their democratic process and are still working out. And so what we have the opportunity is to take advantage of the rule of law, which means that the laws that we have on the books are actually enforced, and they're enforced fairly. And that's an opportunity for our leaders and our government to do that fully for all citizens. And I think this is where the issues of accountability and fairness come in and are really what citizens are watching for when they're looking at their leaders and how those leaders are engaging the rule of law, the rules that are on the books, and those people and officials that are charged with carrying those out. Democracies really have to demonstrate that the state will punish perpetrators of violence regularly and swiftly, and really importantly, equally, regardless of their ideology, that the tools of a state, whether that's the police or the courts, will not mete out justice because, well, we like that person more, we like that party more, but that it really is this rule of law is fair across the board. And it's also important that democracies show that they do this through the courts and not through police violence or other means. Research and experience in the United States and Europe and other comparable democracies have shown us just how important these are. Rachel was talking a bit about what we're seeing in Europe. Trust in government has been highest when people believe that the courts and the police are fair. And what that means is that they know that whatever happens, it's not, we're not looking at who is the person who did it or which party do they represent or which group are they from, but really if they have broken the law, that they will be held accountable regardless of who they are. And that people in those societies where you see courts and police doing their job fairly and with accountability, they trust each other more, which then reinforces, it undermines polarization, it undermines many of these disturbing trends that we're seeing right now in the United States. And we see that there is that trust when they believe that the courts, the police, and others will enforce laws equally. In contrast, there was a study that looked at Germany and the United States and Israel, and that found that within the terrorist community, the domestic terrorist community, that when domestic terrorists believe that the government is ideologically on their side, they are more likely to use violence, which just shows that when people have a perception that the tools of government are tilted either in their favor or in the other, it significantly impacts their behavior. It's really critical to avoid disproportionate police force. We've seen that in many places in the United States and around the world. We have an example of the US militia movement grew in the 1990s in the wake of government using guns blazing tactics in Waco and a number of other places. But then that died down when the government shifted its approach towards arresting, charging members of illegal militias while not overusing force. So let me just flag a few things which are important. Legal accountability for political violence is crucial. We have to see that there will be arrests and investigation of those who commit political violence. We obviously saw tremendous violence on January 6th when there was an attempt to overturn the election. And the fact that there have been hundreds of arrests and investigation and prosecutions have significantly reduced the capacity and the level of the organization, the groups that were behind the violence that day. So legal accountability is really important. Upholding impartial rule of law is also really tremendously important. We have a strong rule of law tradition in the United States, and it's important that we continue to lean into that, ensure that we have independent judiciaries that are both in practice and perception, reinforcing that they can be the trusted holders of American law. I think the fact that we have been struggling for many years now with election denialism is a tremendous, is a really serious threat to our democracy. It undermines the faith in the courts as the ultimate arbiter of election-related disputes. The reality is, in our country, if there are concerns about our election, we have processes, and those processes were used in 2020. Processes to challenge if there was an election perception of a fraud, that can go to a court, and the court does its job. That is the rule of law in action. But when we have leaders that are denying the elections broadly, or even calling for fraud before the elections have taken place, we're undermining the trust, and we're undermining also that system which allows us to look to the courts to be the arbiter of those issues. So there are many others, but I'll stop on that point.
Thank you. Again, each of these points is so rich, but let's move on to the next quite different strategy you highlight in the piece, which is the role of political incentives that are embedded in the electoral system we have here in the US, and that every electoral system has in a democracy, and how they can play a role in fueling or dampening the risks of violence. Could you unpack that point for us, Rachel, and the lessons for the US as you see them?
Sure. When I look at political violence, I look at kind of three levels, like an iceberg. There's a trigger level. There's an event or a person who's going to commit violence. What do you do about them? Do you arrest them? Do you deter them? Do you harden a site so it's less likely to be affected, like we're doing with elections sites that are getting barbed wire and big fences and so on? Those are all ways to deter the moment of violence. But then there's this amplification level. There's people who are stoking violence. They might never pull a trigger themselves, but these are the political leaders, the media leaders, we call them conflict entrepreneurs, who are kind of trying to get people more amped up in one way or another. What do you do about them? And that was my first answer was, if Nicole and law enforcement is dealing with this trigger, this moment of event, or these bad actors, then, political leaders need to rein in their rhetoric and so on. But now we're getting to that third level, which is incentives. What are the structural incentives that cause people to want to be conflict entrepreneurs? And there's financial incentives. Sometimes you can make money off it, like grift. There's social incentives. Sometimes you can belong more to a group by doing it, or you can gain fame or power. But there are really strong political incentives. And so to zero in on those political incentives that incentivize conflict entrepreneurs, we see in many countries, different systems create different levels of likelihood of violence. It doesn't mean there's a perfect system. We see political violence in every system, but some are more at risk, right? You can be a runner and still have a heart attack, but running certainly helps most people not have a heart attack, right? Exercising. So that's what we're talking about. Our system has three categories of structure that are all making it at higher risk. We're a presidential system. Presidential systems tend to be pretty brittle, in part because the legitimacy, we call it a check and balance, that Congress and the president are different. And it is a check and balance against authoritarianism, but it can also set you up for inherent conflict. And we saw that in the States in the 1870s. Quite a lot of the conflict in the 1870s and 90s was between governors and their legislatures. We're a two-party system, and two-party systems are more inherent, are more given to conflict because it's an us and a them. There's not another set of options. You can't break it down and say, well, I don't really side with the far left, but I'm here in this place and here's my party, or I don't really side with this part of the right, but here's my party. We don't get that kind of representational option set, so it creates an us-them, helps polarization. Third, we're a winner-take-all system. And this is probably the biggest incentivization for violence, because if you're in a proportional system and you get one extra vote in a district, well, that might give you 0.0001% extra seats in parliament, right? It's just not that much of a deal to get one extra vote. But if you're in a winner-take-all system, getting one extra vote might win you the whole district. And particularly when you're in a winner-take-all system where the legislature is very closely held. America hasn't had a legislature that can kind of tip either way like this in so many elections since Reconstruction. Well, then getting that extra district might get you all of Congress, or at least the Senate or the House. And so the pressure to win that extra voter is really high. And the pressure to put pressure on the election system, various electoral shenanigans, very, very high. And we've certainly seen that throughout our history. But the pressure to use violence to scare voters away from the polls, to scare away candidates, to force them not to compete. Liz Cheney could barely campaign in Wyoming during her last election season because of all the threats. She kept having to not tell people about events until right beforehand. Really hard to campaign when no one can know about your event. Also happening to Democrats, of course, but that kind of structural system puts a lot of pressure on using violence to gain those couple of votes. And so America has unfortunately a pretty deadly trio of combined structural factors that push toward violence.
And any quick word on promising ways to address that?
Sure. I mean, you can change the system. So it's not as if proportional representation is perfect. Look at Israel and the problems it's having. It's got a very low threshold proportional representation system, but even Germany and so on, there's no perfect system. However, when you're dealing with the problems in America, moving more toward a PR system would probably help a lot. And that's what Ireland did, by the way, when Ireland was in its troubles and having a significant amount of political violence. One part of the Good Friday Agreement was to move from winner take all to a more proportional representation system to deal with that exact problem. We could also move more toward ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, where you pick 1, 2, 3, 4 and rank your candidates, sort of allows for multiple flavors of political party. You can have multiple Republicans and multiple Democrats running against each other. People who run campaigns hate it because they're not used to it, and it's harder to run campaigns. It's harder to know if you're going to win. So you get a lot of the political class saying, God, no, don't have ranked choice voting. However, when you look at the effects in terms of friendliness among politicians, reduced polarization, reduced negative campaigning, it has really positive effects for the body politic, because you have these different flavors of candidate running against each other, so it's not as much us, them, and because you're campaigning to be someone's second choice vote, and that makes you just nicer, less negative, less willing to have a scorched earth strategy because you need those second votes to win.
Thank you. We're short on time. I will just note quickly that one structural element that makes our system distinctive is our system of binding party primaries, which is unique in the democratic world, which are relatively low turnout affairs compared to the general election and tend to be more party activists. So it contributes to the polarization and potentially this alignment of the extremes and in turn political violence.
You're absolutely right. Sorry, I should have said that both PR and ranked choice would need to replace the binding party, political party primary for that exact reason. The party primaries are the primary problem.
Great. We're trying to tackle so much in a short time here. Let me turn to the fourth strategy. Nicole, you talk about the important role of communities in organizing for peace. Please say more.
We've been talking about a lot of things that are very much at the high level and are extraordinarily important and all are worthy of being unpacked, I think, in depth. And we've talked about political leadership and incentives and rule of law. But I think it's really important that people know also that local communities have a very important role and opportunity and responsibility of preventing violence themselves. And what we've seen in a number of places is really remarkable cross-sectoral and cross-partisan groups coming together to really think about how do you protect a democracy, not how you agree on absolutely everything that's happening in the world, but how do you really come together to protect a democratic community. We saw it in Kenya in the 1990s where it was racked with violence. There was a movement really led by women in Kenya that brought together people, and it brought together businesses, women's groups, faith groups, local leaders to meet regularly, building trust and understanding amongst themselves on how to solve problems and how to then work together to prevent violence among their respective communities, so that they were showing that they were coming together as a bulwark. We're seeing that in the United States. There are a number of groups, Over Zero, the Carter Center, Common Ground USA, have really been doing this community peace building work to ensure that people are coming together really to think about how do you push back on political violence and how do you strengthen democracy. We saw that also in Pennsylvania, where there was a lot of rhetoric that was and disinformation about the Haitian immigrant communities there, and really stoking violence and tension in that community. A group that was cross-sectoral, cross-ideological leaders came together. Common Ground USA played a really important role, and they brought this group together. And again, it was business people, education leaders, faith communities, women's groups, and they tapped their networks to really spur quick reactions from local leaders, including a prominent local Republican elected official and others, to push back on the rhetoric and reduce the risk of violence in their community. We need to know that individual people have the ability to take hold in their communities and make and be the leaders in their communities against political violence.
Thank you. Okay, Rachel, the last pillar you highlight in the piece is that activists and political leaders must police their flanks. Tell us more about that. How does it differ from the earlier point you made about leadership, and what are you seeing in the US on this front?
Sure. So very commonly, you have large swaths of the public who want to be nonviolent and small groups who want to use violence as a tactic. And reams of research has shown that violence is not the best tactic, that more often than not, it loses you your goal, nevertheless. And so you need people to say no to the violence within their ranks. That's both rhetorical, as I was saying earlier, but it's also very practical, because people who are angered can get violent, especially if they're confronted with strong policing or overly strong policing tactics. In America, the big groups that do a lot of protests actually train their people a lot on this. They do a lot of training to have people try to calm and de-escalate and reduce the likelihood of violent flanks. But there's less embodied training than there had been in the past. In the 60s, during the civil rights era, for instance, when people knew that protests were going to be met with violence, there was a lot of embodied training where people would have to feel what it was like to be met with some level of violence in a safe area and feel how they could keep themselves calm. We do that less often now, and that's part of policing your violent flanks and keeping it from happening. On the right, you have extraordinarily low levels of policing of the violent flanks. So you have lots of armed protests and so on that are much more spontaneous. They're not necessarily groups that are working to kind of plan the protests and so on. And so there it's more everything goes. And we really need all sides to that could get inflamed to keep the cap on their violent flanks.
Thank you. Well, again, we walked through those quickly. To recap them, leaders must insist on nonviolence. Governments and leaders must support the rule of law. Countries must alter political incentives. Communities must organize for peace, and activists and political leaders must police their flanks. So before I turn to some of these questions I'm already seeing coming in from the audience, let's turn our gaze to the coming week and weeks and months here in the US. Obviously, these are long-term strategies that are mutually reinforcing, But we have an extremely close contested election coming up next week and a potentially risky transition period to follow. So a two-part question here. Start with Rachel and Nicole if you want to add anything. One, what kinds of political violence threats are you most concerned about related to the election and transition? And two, which of these kinds of strategies and tactics or others are most important or relevant to emphasize in the coming weeks?
Sure. So let me start with what I'm least worried about, actually. I'm least worried about violence on election day. Violence on election day is very rare all around the world. People are generally working on getting out their votes, especially in this election. And so people should not be scared to go to the polls. It's really important to not be scared. Might there be sporadic things, especially intimidation, sporadic intimidation, someone carrying a gun too close to the polls? Yes, we are a big country. We are a heavily armed country. There are many places where open carry is legal. I would be surprised if there wasn't some of that. But is it likely to be a widespread big problem? No. So people should feel safe going to the polls. What I'm most worried about is post-election day. What I'm most worried about is that we don't expect to have a result right away. People should not expect to have a result for a number of days. This is an extremely high turnout election. It is an extraordinarily close election, maybe the closest and highest turnout we've had in modern times. And we have states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that can't start counting absentee ballots until the day of the election. Just taking the ballot out of its envelope, flattening it, and putting it through the machine takes time. Making sure the signature matches takes time. So we will not have a result right away. People need to expect that, not think that there's anything wrong happening. While we don't have a result, however, there's likely to be a lot of dis and misinformation floating around. And there's also likely to be a lot of people jumping to conclusions. And so my second point, I'm sort of conflating question one and question two here, Mark. Second point is give people some grace. Expect some innocent mistakes. Don't jump to conclusions. Our elections in America are the most distributed in the world. We don't have a national election system that gives us some safety against foreign interference and so on. But it also means that our elections are run county by county, largely by women over 65. There are large swaths of them that are brand new this election season because the threats that we mentioned before have scared so many people away. So you have a lot of older women. They could be your mom. They are helping our elections, and they don't necessarily have a lot of background in what they're doing. Innocent mistakes are going to happen, and we need to expect them. However, to get back to your first question, a lot of people will read those mistakes as nefarious. And there might also be other things. We're in hurricane season. What if there's another hurricane on an election day or what have you? So people need to recognize that these mistakes will happen, but there will be people pushing dis and misinformation, pushing them to read these as nefarious, purposeful, intentional, and the likelihood that there will be people getting angry and people grabbing arms because we are such a heavily armed country, and people going to their state capitals or going to the homes of the people that they think have done something wrong and intimidating them, yelling at them, walking in front of their homes with guns. That's unfortunately a somewhat high likelihood during that period of uncertainty, and particularly if people feel that their candidate is being wronged. We don't know who will win this one, and it's really a 50-50 election. It is so close, and either side could win. We just have to expect that. But that likelihood of post-election mobs at people's homes trying to affect how they vote, how they decide a vote, how they certify, very high. And while all the procedures are in place right now to come out with what the voters' will is at the end of the day, the number of people working on the side of good here to try to bolster our elections and make people understand how transparent and fair our election system is. It's tens of thousands of people working to do the right thing here, but it only takes a couple of people on the other side to cause mayhem. And so just trying to remember all the good folks doing a lot with the agency they have, but recognizing that anger is likely to focus on them and they're going to need our support.
I echo absolutely everything that Rachel just said. I would just add a few things. I am concerned about just this ongoing pressure that's on our election workers beforehand, and we've seen it just increased in a lot of places, which is why some people have left a very admirable point of service, and because they had been experiencing that. I too am not concerned about the day of, but some of those trends that we're seeing that will likely manifest themselves after the election. I do think what I will be also watching is just the rhetoric from leaders. Right. It's one of the things which we talked about in the five different elements. Leaders play an important role day by day, hour by hour, in how we are feeling about this. And if leaders are stoking our anxiety and they are talking to their supporters to say that you can deal with that anxiety by doing this or doing that, which is really reaching for political violence as a solution, they are part of stoking the violence that we hope will not come. But there are many, many of us that are concerned that that is what we will see in the coming days.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn to some of these audience questions here. We got an interesting specific one about FEMA. Can you talk a bit about the recent violence and threats against FEMA workers specifically? How typical is political violence against disaster relief workers? I don't know, Rachel, if you have some insight on that.
Sure, I'll jump in, and Nicole, please jump in. So unfortunately, in low trust societies, it is very common for people to attack people who are trying to help them. We saw this with Ebola, when Ebola hit Central Africa, and a number of people were blaming, there were conspiracies around, oh, they're bringing Ebola to our communities, not trying to fight it. Now it's similar with FEMA. The problem is a lack of trust. When you have, you don't want perfect trust in your government, don't get me wrong. There's a reason to be slightly skeptical of any leadership system, but our trust in America has plummeted, and it started plummeting during the Vietnam War and Watergate for some pretty darn good reasons. But now it is low for reasons far beyond what make any sense whatsoever in a pretty well-functioning system with a lot of good people in it. And that lack of trust gives way to conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are very highly linked to violence. People believe that elites are trying to harm them or trying to undermine them. And so we see that in country after country. Unfortunately, we haven't seen it a lot in America before, so it's an extremely bad sign that we're seeing it now.
I'll just add to that, agree with what Rachel said. The fact that we have misinformation and disinformation that is rampant, both from external sources, so from other governments, autocratic leaders who would love to sow chaos in American democracy. It's really to the benefit of China or Russia or Iran to have the United States less stable. We have those outside forces coming with misinformation or disinformation. We are guarding against them, but that's a reality of the threat that we are under as a nation. There are also sources domestically that are trying to sow misinformation, disinformation, and spread rumors. And that really does tap into, that's the manifestation of what Rachel's talking about. That is where mistrust is built, is by people saying, well, did you see this article? I got it from my friend who said that the FEMA people are doing. We also have a responsibility as individuals and as leaders in our communities to look at what type of information are we consuming, how are we ensuring that we are not just reacting to something which just came across our screen with 144 characters quickly, but that we're really thinking about what is the concern? Is this a real concern? Have I double checked it? And then what is a way that I can use democratic institutions and processes to address if there really is a concern in my community?
Great, let's get to another question here. Pedro Rodriguez Duarte asks about the link between political violence and polarization. He says, we know the world, not only the US, is very polarized nowadays. Migration, green transition, taxes, gender issues, for instance, are controversial matters. How is the American way of addressing those controversies different from the European?
I'll jump in here again, if you don't mind, because I'm working on an article right now for the Journal of Democracy where I'm looking at political violence in different countries that are consolidated democracies. And there is no correlation with polarization. And I was really surprised. And I said, well, what the heck is going on? It sure seems like polarization leads to political violence, but it's mediated. So lots of countries, first of all, it's hard to tell cross-country because what feels polarizing to a Norwegian might feel like day-to-day life to an Alaskan. You know, people have different levels of tolerance for conflict and disagreement. But not to slight Alaskans or Norwegians, I'm one of those categories. But what we see is that some countries are very polarized and you don't see political violence. Some countries strike us as less polarized, and we're seeing quite high levels of political violence. And so it's hard to tease out. And what we wrote about in the article is that it's mediated by political parties. If you're really polarized, and your political party leaders are telling you one way you can deal with that is violence, or that violence is okay, that makes it much more likely that that polarization is going to lead to violence rather than it leading to something else. I mean, in Austria, for years, you had people shopping at different supermarkets if they were in different political parties. Maybe not fabulous, but a lot more fabulous than taking shots at one another. So there's a lot of ways to deal with the fact that you don't really like other people, and violence is only one very bad way of dealing with that problem.
Yeah, I'll just add, it goes back to the comment I made earlier. All of the points that Pedro puts in his migration, taxes, all of these things are really divisive, and they're hard issues, and they're ones which I feel very strongly about, and I may or may not agree with my colleagues. And they're really important that we debate them out. And people should know, gosh, I feel strongly about migration or about taxes or healthcare. And I really, really want my way to win. The question is not about whether we are going to have hard issues that are going to have to be debated out in society. The question is, are we going to use our democratic tools, or are we going to use political violence? Are we going to shop somewhere else, which is a great way if that's what works for you, or if you're going to go and write to your congressperson, or if you're going to go and protest on the street, use all of those civil tools. Political violence is not the way. That those really important, essential public policy issues should be addressed. And I think that's the moment that many countries are in. The United States, many countries in Europe, many consolidated democracies around the world are, each individual person and leader is making that choice. Am I going to address these things, which are a natural part of every democracy? Am I going to address them by stoking or reaching for political violence, or am I going to do it in a way which is going to be constructive and keep my society together?
Great. So Tom Kahn asks, Rachel discussed the history of U.S. political violence in the U.S., providing historical context. Is the problem we face today consistent with, less than, or more severe than violence throughout our history, excluding, of course, the Civil War period? Rachel, what do you think?
I'll leave that one to you, Rachel.
Okay. You know, it's just different. And let me just say, I'm looking at the Q&A here. We have terrific questions here. I wish we could go for an extra half hour. It is such a high quality group of questions. I'm sorry we're not going to get to answer all of them. I'll try to be quick for that reason. It's just different. We have had a lot more violence in other periods of our history. There's a great book by Edward Foley, called Ballot Battles, about the 19th century violence around elections. And it got pretty bad. And during political realignments, it gets pretty bad in America. In the 1920s, which was one of our big political realignment periods, we had a lot of violence against miners and strikers and all sorts of people that was very sanctioned by the Supreme Court at the time. We've had things that look like minor wars that are kind of local wars in a number of places, because political leaders take one side in local battles. What's going on now is different because of social media. It's very easy to organize people. It's easy to organize people for good things, and it's easy to organize people for bad things. And because of that, what we're seeing is less grouped violence. It used to be that if you wanted to have violence, you had to have a group of people who wanted to have violence. That makes it more easy to have war, because groups can sustain violence over time. So when you look at wars, you look at, how many organized groups that are armed are there. But groups also hold each other back from violence. So militias and so on can tend to be people who know each other, often family members and friends, and they can say, hey man, you don't want to get arrested. Let's, keep it to the level of rhetoric. Ungrouped violence, which is what we're seeing now, where the majority of people using political violence are individuals who radicalize online with a community online and then go off and act, and then play back to that community. This is for school shooters, mass shooters, but also for political violence. There's nobody holding them back. And so it's much more randomized, less able to kind of metastasize into a war, but much harder to control, harder to infiltrate individuals, harder to stop them. So it's just different.
Okay, Robert Lindsay asks, would ranked choice voting act to stem the election of extremists? I'm happy to take this one quickly. On another hat, I sit on the board of Fair Vote, which is the organization in the US that promotes ranked choice voting. So I think the short answer is it can and it could. And there are a few different applications to think about with ranked choice voting. In single winner elections, like we have in the US, winner take all elections, the most transformative thing it does is it's like an instant runoff. It requires 50% plus one to get a winner. So just by virtue of requiring greater consensus, it can help avoid in a multi-winner race, or sorry, a multi-candidate race, the election of a more extreme candidate that wouldn't be appealing to the rest. Within our primary system, it can also make a difference because you often have party primaries with multiple candidates. And so if ranked choice voting is applied to primaries, which it has been done in Virginia, for example, it tends to elect a more consensus-focused, oriented representative of that party. So that person going on to the general election is more likely to be less extreme. Now, where it can be really powerful is in its proportional representation application, which is, as Rachel described, what they have in Ireland, where you have proportional ranked choice voting. So you have districts with multiple members or seats allocated from those districts, and people rank their choices. And what you end up getting as a result is a more proportional allocation and proportional representation of people's views, which then reduces the sort of two-party binary that contributes to the tension. So that's a really short version. We could go on much longer. Anything you'd add to that, Rachel or Nicole?
That's great.
Okay. Let's see, checking time here. How should the press and media respond appropriately to counter political violent rhetoric? It's a big question, but
I'm happy to jump in on that, but naturally, Rachel or Mark, feel free. It's a great question, James. Thank you for it. There are a lot of different ways. I think one, media can choose not to stoke it, right? To not stoke whatever the rhetoric is or add to it. Our media has to be fact-based and professional, right? And so it's really important that when there is also an allegation of some salacious, that FEMA workers are doing terrible things, the media has an opportunity to put forward what the information is about what is FEMA actually doing. And then people can make a wise judgment on, really, I love what FEMA is doing, or I hate what FEMA is doing. And then they can handle it through democratic processes. But the media has a really big burden to provide fact-based information to people, to allow people to make decisions not based on what things popped across their screen really quickly from their cousin, but really the facts that are going to help them make decisions. And that contributes then also to not choosing political violence as the way you're going to solve a specific issue. I do think we have a challenge on our media environment. I think the challenge is both from the consumers, because we're not always consuming media well. We are choosing to consume media from sources which are actually not media and getting our information from other places. But we also, there's a lot of pressure on media, and given our current media market, a lot of pressure to move in different directions that are polarizing or that are leaning in the direction of one political ideology or another. And what we really need is a movement back to fact-based reporting and less commentary, where people are saying, I can go to that place and I can just find out what did FEMA do yesterday. And that's going to really serve our society to have fact-based information, which is also going to then help build trust back in our society.
Absolutely. I put in the answer 2 pieces I've written and consulted on for newspapers. And the only thing I would add, or for media in general, the only thing I would add to Nicole's answer is that we need to return to some local journalism. The research is really clear about how important local journalism is for building trust and getting out of this kind of national level polarization. And the ownership structure in America is decimating local journalism. And so we really need to get it back.
And what we also know on that point, when people are in touch with people in their community, they know the problems in their community, they know the people because they go shopping or they have a soccer team with them, they solve problems. And they solve problems across political parties, they solve them across racial and other, and communities have issues, they always do, but they are able to solve things because they know it is what they are going to experience on a daily basis. So the more we have local media, we have local leaders that are engaged in their community, working on a cross-partisan way to actually solve problems, the less polarization we're going to have and the less people are going to reach to political violence.
I feel like I have to add to that the role of social media, and
oh yes,
what we're looking at in this coming election is concerning, at least to me, in terms of, compared to the last couple of election cycles, we have a less platform moderation, that's less moderation of content that could be insightful, harmful conspiracy theories that could contribute to political violence. There's just less of that for a variety of reasons. We all know about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, but there's also been somewhat of a chilling effect on the state's sort of government's regulatory, or the government's sort of information sharing role when it comes to this issue. Much longer conversation, but between that and the foreign influence kind of risks, it is a major concern. And as we highlight in our Freedom on the Net report that came out just a week or two ago, at a bare minimum, the US needs to have more transparency around the platform's policies and their content moderation. There are models like in Europe with the Digital Services Act where we could go much further and require them to adopt a risk-based approach to sort of harmful content moderation, but at a bare minimum, transparency into how they're addressing these issues so the public and researchers can see, oh, your algorithms are actually potentially contributing to these problems or not. That would be a good starting point. Let me turn to an important question. Let me find it here, from Amma Marston. Thank you for this very important information. What makes you almost hopeful about positive change?
I was just sidebarring Mark to say, pick Amma's question. Amma, it's a great question. I am really hopeful because the United States is a strong democracy. We have all of the rules and infrastructure in place. We work in a lot of places around the world where that does not exist. There's no history of democracy, there's no institutions, and there's no regimes that want to do it. We are fortunate in the United States. We have the institutions, we have the laws on the books, we have processes, and we have gone through a lot in our history. My parents lived much, much worse, less free lives than I did. And the trajectory is in the right direction. The trajectory is in the right direction because individual people made individual choices at the ballot box, in their interactions with other people, in their choices of violence versus democracy, and leaders made choices. And that's really what turns a democracy around, is our belief and the use of a system. So I'm hopeful because we have all the tools we need. We just have to use them, and we as the society and we as leaders have to make those choices to maintain and strengthen our democracy.
I'm very much with Nicole here. I love Winston Churchill's quote about the United States. It might be not actually Winston Churchill saying it, but it sounds like it is. So, he says the United States always does the right thing after exhausting all other possible options. And that is our history. We do get to the right thing. We have had a trend of positivity. People often ignore it nowadays, but Pete Buttigieg, who I knew before he became who he became, so I'm not talking about him from a political perspective, but just as an old colleague, spoke quite movingly about how a family like his, a gay family with kids, was unthinkable even when he was a child, and then became pretty normal but in his lifetime. That trajectory of the United States is not an easy one. It's never linear. There's always polarization and backlash when big changes happen. And we do tend to exhaust every other possible bad option before we get to the right one. But we do eventually get to the right one. And so there's so many good people working to get us out of this period, which is a pretty ugly period, but we've had ugly periods before, and move us to the next chapter of what will America become. And I think we really need our eyes on that prize. What will America become? We're the most multicultural democracy that's ever existed in the world. We are the biggest multicultural democracy that's ever existed in the world. We're the longest lived multicultural democracy. It's a big deal. And we'll get there, but it's hard. And we're seeing the kind of hard parts now.
Well, that's a great note to end on. And thank you, Amma, for asking that question so that we could end there. With that, let me thank Rachel and Nicole and all of you participating in the discussion today for being here and for the work that you're doing to better understand and prevent political violence around the world and here in the US. I know many of you in the call are deeply engaged in these issues. We will have a full recording of this session available on Freedom House's YouTube channel in the coming days, and we look forward to staying connected with you all. If you're not already, please do follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter for more information about future Freedom House events. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.